The meeting invitation arrived at 7:48 a.m., worded as coldly as a maintenance alert. No subject line, no indication of urgency, just a calendar block titled Alignment Review. I had attended hundreds of these over the years, sometimes about restructuring servers, sometimes about scaling architecture, but never with this many executives copied in. My instincts, sharpened through years of navigating egos disguised as leaders, told me something was amiss. Still, I dressed as always, tie straight, shirt pressed, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because discipline had shaped my character long before the company learned to spell the word innovation. The boardroom was unusually cheerful when I entered. The blinds were drawn halfway, letting in a sliver of morning sun that glistened against the polished table. People smiled, not the kind that welcomes you, but the kind that celebrates your absence before you even sit down. The CTO, a man who enjoyed the sound of his own voice more than the reality of systems he pretended to understand, stood at the head of the table. He held a folder with the kind of precision one reserves for contracts, not conversations. "Take a seat," he said, nodding toward a chair that seemed deliberately positioned farther away from the others, as if they'd rehearsed distancing me. I sat without speaking. Years of working close to the core of a system had taught me the value of silence. Silence uncovers arrogance faster than confrontation. He cleared his throat dramatically, as if preparing for a eulogy he'd been dying to deliver. "We've completed an internal review," he began, flipping open the folder. "Your legacy code is, let's say, outdated. It no longer aligns with where we're going." He paused, savoring each word. His smile widened. "We've decided to terminate your employment effective immediately." The room exhaled in unison. It wasn't relief. It was triumph. He slid the termination letter toward me. The paper didn't glide, it cut the air like a blade. The executives shifted in their seats, nodding with the enthusiasm of people who had never debugged a single line in their lives. They believed they were witnessing a generational shift, the symbolic removal of a man tethered to the past, replaced by someone who spoke in buzzwords and delivered PowerPoints with confidence. It wasn't enough for them to fire me. They wanted a spectacle. Our new lead developer, the CTO, continued, gesturing grandly toward a young man whose sneakers probably cost more than my monthly mortgage, has already migrated 60% of our systems. He's leveraging modern frameworks that make your legacy infrastructure obsolete. The boy, because that's what he was, wore a grin longer than his resume. He looked at me the way a rookie mistakenly looks at the person whose shoes he thinks he's replaced. "Nothing personal," he said, trying to sound humble but failing miserably. "It's just the future." I'd seen the future before. It usually broke when tested. Applause erupted, actual applause. Executives clapped for a termination, as though firing me was an achievement worthy of champagne. Their laughter skipped across the table like coins tossed into a fountain. They genuinely believed I was dead weight, a relic, something to discard now that the IPO buzz was growing louder. In their minds, code aged like milk, not like architecture. I listened without blinking. Anger wasn't necessary. People who misunderstand systems always reveal their flaws in public. People who misunderstand system builders reveal their stupidity faster. The CTO leaned forward. "You did good work," once, he said, as if reading from a poorly written script. "But the industry has evolved. We need leaner systems, more agile teams, less complication." Complication. That word landed like an insult tossed by someone who had never typed a command that could shut down entire financial ecosystems. My code wasn't complicated. It was comprehensive. It was a nervous system with tendons, ligaments, arteries, redundancies, fail-safes, and silent triggers designed for survival. Not because I wanted control, but because the company once needed protection. They'd forgotten that part. Success breeds amnesia. "What about documentation?" I asked calmly. They exchanged confused glances. The young programmer shrugged. "We don't do old-school documentation," he said, proudly. "Everything is self-explanatory now. Clean. Minimalist. Minimalist." Of course. Minimalism is the religion of people who think complexity can be removed rather than understood. Legacy systems aren't minimal. They are historical. They carry decisions from different eras, engineering choices made during crises, patches applied during mergers, integrations crafted under duress, rules embedded to satisfy regulators who thought technology was magic. Legacy isn't code. Legacy is memory. But explanations weren't necessary. I had already seen how this story would unfold. There are three types of leaders in tech: visionaries, caretakers, and tourists. The room was full of tourists. The CTO closed his laptop. Security will escort you to your desk. Collect your things. Your access will be revoked by noon. He expected a reaction. Rage. Humiliation. Panic. I gave him none. Before I leave, I said, keeping my voice even, do you know how many systems rely on the modules you call legacy? He smirked. We've mapped dependencies. Mapped, yes. Understood, no. I nodded, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of destiny. The company was standing on foundations it considered irrelevant. Ignoring architecture doesn't destroy a building, not immediately. It weakens it invisibly, waiting for the right pressure. When I stood, no one stopped me. They thought they'd ended something. They didn't realize they'd started a countdown. The walk back to my office felt surreal, not because I was shocked, but because the building itself seemed unaware of the collapse brewing beneath its floors. Engineers chatted in hallways, unaware that the infrastructure holding their tools together was about to behave like a wounded machine seeking its missing limb. The servers hummed as they always had, oblivious to the fact that the person who had given them logic was now being removed by people who couldn't distinguish syntax from architecture. My desk was still warm from the morning coffee I hadn't finished. The framed certificate of appreciation from 5 years earlier stared back at me, an artifact from a time when the company begged me to stay late, solve impossible problems, and patch catastrophic failures overnight. The irony wasn't lost on me. In corporate evolution, gratitude has a shelf life shorter than software releases. Security arrived, 2 guards who looked apologetic. They didn't understand the politics of this dismissal. They were merely instructed to observe, ensuring I didn't tamper with anything. If only they knew. You don't tamper with the world you built. You simply stop tending to it. Neglect is a silent force. It doesn't shout. It waits. One of them cleared his throat. Sir, is there anything else you need? Yes, I replied. I need you to remember this moment. He looked puzzled. He didn't know he was witnessing the beginning of a corporate autopsy. He didn't need to. The people who thought power came from titles were about to learn something painful. Power comes from knowledge, not position. I packed slowly, taking nothing more than my personal items. My access badge hung around my neck like a medal from a battle I didn't lose. I placed it on the desk, leaving it face up. The photo captured a younger version of me, less gray hair, less patience, more hope. Companies don't age well with their creators. They believe youth equals progress. In reality, youth equals untested enthusiasm. As I walked toward the elevator, employees nodded politely, unaware they were shaking hands with the final barrier between their future and chaos. Systems don't collapse in movies, they collapse in silence. They begin with missing knowledge, then escalate through assumptions, and finally explode under pressure. The elevator doors closed slowly, as if resisting. For a moment, I saw my reflection, calm, composed, unaffected. I didn't feel defeated. I felt liberated. Legacy doesn't fear replacement. Legacy challenges it. They thought firing me was a victory. They didn't understand it was the last stable event before consequences. When the elevator reached the ground floor, I stepped out into the sunlight. Behind me stood a company convinced it had embraced innovation. Ahead of me lay a world that still valued the architects who understood systems, not slogans. They fired me like a janitor. They forgot I wrote the keys, the locks, and the doors. The celebration had begun. The collapse was already scheduled. The day after my departure, the company's new development team entered the system with the same overconfidence a tourist brings to a foreign market, wide-eyed, enthusiastic, dangerously unaware. They believed they understood architecture because they recognized syntax. They thought experience was optional. They assumed software was a spreadsheet, something you rearrange, repaint, and reinvent without consequence. The hotshot developer who had replaced me swaggered into the engineering hub as though he were a conqueror. Screens lit up with dashboards he barely comprehended. Color-coded diagrams were projected on the wall, showing simplified charts the CTO proudly presented during board meetings. They had mistaken visual clarity for structural integrity. What they didn't realize was that my code didn't operate in diagrams. It existed in layers, logic buried within logic, rules intertwined with systems that controlled millions in financial operations. To them, the codebase was merely old. To me, it was a living organism. Their first task was deceptively simple: update the reporting system for quarterly projections. The young developer opened the main script, expecting an easy edit. What he found instead was a labyrinth. A change in one function triggered a ripple across modules: risk analysis, asset allocation, compliance checks, and tax integrations, each woven together over years of business shifts, legal reforms, mergers, and regulatory adjustments. He paused and frowned. This was not the modular utopia he preached in job interviews. This was code with history, code that carried scars, code that knew how to survive chaos. Still, arrogance fuels bad decisions. He modified a single line, just one, believing modern frameworks didn't require legacy respect. The execution environment froze for 3 seconds. Then, a system-wide alert blinked across screens: integrity check incomplete, dependencies not resolved. He dismissed it. The team gathered around him, offering encouragement. He grinned, tapping the keyboard as though confidence could replace understanding. He pushed the update live. The system rejected his command. He tried again, louder fingers this time, as though force and keystrokes were related. The system denied access. He turned to the CTO, who shrugged and suggested clearing caches, rebooting environments, and forcing commits. In their world, problems were annoyances, not warnings. In the world I built, warnings were survival mechanisms. I had seen developers like this before. They confused speed with mastery. They believed frameworks were shields. They assumed code responded to enthusiasm. But code, especially code tied to money, doesn't care about enthusiasm. It cares about rules, rules the new team never learned. They mocked what protected them. By noon, they were calling emergency stand-ups. Half the engineering floor hovered around screens that displayed errors they pretended not to fear. The young developer typed commands rapidly, trying different approaches, none of which he understood. He wasn't debugging, he was gambling. He didn't realize the system had layers they couldn't access. In my earlier years, the company faced multiple crises: acquisitions, audits, regulatory threats, events nobody remembers because my work prevented disaster. Each crisis added more logic, more branch conditions, more security protocols. The architecture wasn't built in comfort. It was built in fire. The code didn't grow from aesthetic goals, it grew from survival instincts. The new team saw the results, not the history. As the afternoon progressed, error banners changed color. What began as yellow warnings shifted to orange alerts. By late afternoon, red messages replaced dashboards entirely. A screen that once displayed financial projections now read, "Core validation module missing keystone dependency." The young developer laughed nervously. "What's a keystone dependency?" he asked. The room went silent. Keystone dependencies are not taught in tutorials. They don't exist in online courses. They are born when companies outgrow their tools, when regulations evolve faster than software can adapt, when investors demand reports that require logic no one has predicted. My code held keystones not because I enjoyed complexity, but because business required it. The CTO stepped forward, pretending authority. "Just bypass it," he said. Bypass. That was his solution for everything he didn't understand. Skip the part that protects you. Ignore the pillar that holds the roof. Pretend ecosystems behave like Lego bricks. The young developer tried to bypass the keystone dependency. The system responded immediately. Access revoked. Permission denied. Structure locked. I had predicted this arrogance long before it manifested. That's why I embedded self-preservation triggers, mechanisms that protected the network from uninformed modifications. Not sabotage. Safeguards. If a surgeon operates without knowing anatomy, the body shuts down. My system behaved the same way. The team began dissecting modules. They opened scripts containing annotations in shorthand only senior engineers from a decade ago could decipher. Comments referred to conditions that no longer existed, decisions based on markets that had since stabilized, and integrations from mergers erased from company history. The code had geological layers like sediment, each one recording a business season. They weren't reading instructions. They were reading archaeology. Somebody finally asked, "Who designed this?" The CTO answered with forced confidence. "He did," he said, meaning me. "But don't worry. We're modernizing." Modernizing is a dangerous word in the hands of amateurs. It implies progress, but ignores the cost of transition. Modernizing without understanding is demolition disguised as improvement. The system denied access. He turned to the CTO, who shrugged and suggested clearing caches, rebooting environments, and forcing commits. In their world, problems were annoyances, not warnings. In the world I built, warnings were survival mechanisms. I had seen developers like this before. They confused speed with mastery. They believed frameworks were shields. They assumed code responded to enthusiasm. But code, especially code tied to money, doesn't care about enthusiasm. It cares about rules the new team never learned. They mocked what protected them. By noon, they were calling emergency stand-ups. Half the engineering floor hovered around screens that displayed errors they pretended not to fear. The young developer typed commands rapidly, trying different approaches, none of which he understood. He wasn't debugging, he was gambling. He didn't realize the system had layers they couldn't access. In my earlier years, the company faced multiple crises: acquisitions, audits, regulatory threats, events nobody remembers because my work prevented disaster. Each crisis added more logic, more branch conditions, more security protocols. The architecture wasn't built in comfort. It was built in fire. The code didn't grow from aesthetic goals, it grew from survival instincts. The new team saw the results, not the history. As the afternoon progressed, error banners changed color. What began as yellow warnings shifted to orange alerts. By late afternoon, red messages replaced dashboards entirely. A screen that once displayed financial projections now read, "Core validation module missing keystone dependency." The young developer laughed nervously. "What's a keystone dependency?" he asked. The room went silent. Keystone dependencies are not taught in tutorials. They don't exist in online courses. They are born when companies outgrow their tools, when regulations evolve faster than software can adapt, when investors demand reports that require logic no one has predicted. My code held keystones not because I enjoyed complexity, but because business required it. The CTO stepped forward, pretending authority. "Just bypass it," he said. Bypass. That was his solution for everything he didn't understand. Skip the part that protects you. Ignore the pillar that holds the roof. Pretend ecosystems behave like Lego bricks. The young developer tried to bypass the keystone dependency. The system responded immediately. Access revoked. Permission denied. Structure locked. I had predicted this arrogance long before it manifested. That's why I embedded self-preservation triggers, mechanisms that protected the network from uninformed modifications. Not sabotage. Safeguards. If a surgeon operates without knowing anatomy, the body shuts down. My system behaved the same way. The team began dissecting modules. They opened scripts containing annotations in shorthand only senior engineers from a decade ago could decipher. Comments referred to conditions that no longer existed, decisions based on markets that had since stabilized, and integrations from mergers erased from company history. The code had geological layers like sediment, each one recording a business season. They weren't reading instructions. They were reading archaeology. Somebody finally asked, "Who designed this?" The CTO answered with forced confidence. "He did," he said, meaning me. "But don't worry. We're modernizing." Modernizing is a dangerous word in the hands of amateurs. It implies progress, but ignores the cost of transition. Modernizing without understanding is demolition disguised as improvement. The countdown had begun. 3 months passed, not slowly, not quietly, but with the speed of people who believe momentum equals mastery. I watched from a distance, not because I cared about the company's theatrics, but because curiosity is a habit engineers can unlearn. Systems behave like organisms. When they are wounded, they don't scream immediately. They bleed internally first. Those who inflict the wound celebrate while the infection spreads. The company's branding changed almost overnight. Sleek posters covered downtown billboards with phrases like "Innovation Reborn" and "The future has no memory." The irony was exquisite. The same executives who once begged me to stay late now paraded around with slogans meant to erase the past that built their present. My name, once printed on achievement certificates, vanished as though history could be deleted by marketing. Then came the announcement. The company was preparing for a $2 billion IPO, an initial public offering so ambitious it turned their headquarters into a carnival of misplaced optimism. Screens in the lobby displayed animated countdowns, and banners hung from the ceiling proclaiming a new era. The CTO strutted from one interview to another like a prophet who had dragged civilization into the light. Investors lined up to worship a product they didn't understand, led by executives who understood it even less. Every article repeated the same script. The new development team rebuilt the core infrastructure from scratch, modernizing every aspect of the company's digital ecosystem. Not a single journalist questioned the claim. They didn't ask how a team that couldn't resolve a dependency 3 months earlier had suddenly built a scalable architecture for markets regulators scrutinized like hawks. Nobody wondered why a business that once relied on stability had pivoted to swagger. The public loves a good myth, especially when ego narrates it. The young programmer became their mascot. He appeared in promotional videos wearing a hoodie and sneakers, speaking confidently about his revolutionary vision. He claimed that legacy code was dead weight, dragging the company into the past. Reporters clapped. Influencers quoted him. Competitors took notes. They mistook his vocabulary for intelligence and his arrogance for insight. He called my code a relic of the past. His words were repeated so often they became scripture within the company walls. Employees who once asked me for guidance now scoffed at anything longer than a tweet. Meetings became pep rallies. Decisions turned into slogans. Charts replaced reasoning. The company wasn't transforming, it was hallucinating. Executives held soirees in private lounges, ordering champagne like they were already billionaires. They bragged about valuations, partnerships, and the inevitability of success. I knew the pattern well. Corporate leaders often confuse anticipation with achievement. Their celebration wasn't proof of progress, it was camouflage for ignorance. But what fascinated me wasn't their arrogance. It was the silence that followed their announcements. Silence hides questions. Silence hides flaws. Silence hides systems preparing to avenge themselves. Because while they boasted of modernization, they had no idea that the architecture they were standing on wasn't fully theirs. The new code, so proudly advertised, still depended on legacy modules, my modules. They had wrapped new paint around old steel, plastered modern frameworks onto foundations they didn't understand, and built an IPO dream atop logic they dismissed as obsolete. Relic, yes. But relics are dangerous when misunderstood. In engineering, there are 3 catastrophic assumptions. If something has worked for years, it will keep working forever. If nobody understands a system, nobody needs to. If it hasn't failed yet, it never will. They embraced all 3. Inside the company, the culture shifted from caution to hubris. Risk assessment meetings became storytelling sessions. Compliance teams stopped questioning anomalies. Financial analysts trusted dashboards they couldn't audit. Everything looked stable on the surface because the metrics lied with elegance. Numbers can deceive. Architecture cannot. While executives toasted their upcoming IPO, departments were quietly reporting inconsistencies, small discrepancies in revenue allocation, unexplained delays in cross-border transactions, and risk projections that fluctuated without cause. The anomalies weren't catastrophic, but they were whispers of something deeper. The system was compensating for changes it wasn't designed to support. I recognized the signs, even from afar. Legacy systems don't fail abruptly. They fracture at the edges. They warn. They test. They resist until exhaustion turns resistance into collapse. But ignorance celebrates before collapse arrives. The company held a press conference 2 months before the IPO. The CEO spoke like a preacher before a congregation, repeating phrases like technological leap, architectural rebirth, and foundational transformation. He puffed out his chest as though vocabulary could rewrite reality. Beside him stood the young programmer, basking in applause he hadn't earned. Cameras flashed. Investors cheered. Analysts nodded approvingly. Not one person asked the most dangerous question in technology: what did you remove to make space for innovation? Systems tolerate additions. They punish removals. The young programmer took the microphone and told the world they had deleted redundant back-end infrastructure. He laughed as he described removing thousands of legacy conditions, conditions regulators once required, conditions auditors once verified, conditions that protected the company from legal ruin. He didn't know relics sometimes hold curses. Legacy code is not decoration. It is the accumulated memory of every mistake, crisis, negotiation, loophole, and legal entanglement a system has survived. Removing it is not modernization, it is amnesia. And amnesia has consequences. The first consequence appeared the following week, though the company didn't recognize it as such. A senior analyst requested historical financial reports from the system. The report generated eventually, but the numbers didn't match previous versions. They differed by fractions. Investors rarely panic over fractions, but auditors do. Fractions are footprints, and footprints reveal ghosts. The engineering team dismissed the issue as rounding errors. They didn't realize rounding errors are symptoms, not causes. The system wasn't rounding incorrectly. It was translating incomplete logic once supported by legacy components they'd mutilated in their quest for modernization. The second consequence surfaced days later. Cross-border transfers began requiring manual approvals. The automation script, built 5 years ago to comply with regulatory constraints, had been disconnected during refactoring. Nobody noticed until a customer complained. The young developer patched it temporarily, but didn't understand why the original logic existed. He believed his patch was superior. Patches create patches. Patches create cracks. Cracks invite collapse. Inside the company, the culture shifted from caution to hubris. Risk assessment meetings became storytelling sessions. Compliance teams stopped questioning anomalies. Financial analysts trusted dashboards they couldn't audit. Everything looked stable on the surface because the metrics lied with elegance. Numbers can deceive. Architecture cannot. While executives toasted their upcoming IPO, departments were quietly reporting inconsistencies, small discrepancies in revenue allocation, unexplained delays in cross-border transactions, and risk projections that fluctuated without cause. The anomalies weren't catastrophic, but they were whispers of something deeper. The system was compensating for changes it wasn't designed to support. I recognized the signs, even from afar. Legacy systems don't fail abruptly. They fracture at the edges. They warn. They test. They resist until exhaustion turns resistance into collapse. But ignorance celebrates before collapse arrives. The company held a press conference 2 months before the IPO. The CEO spoke like a preacher before a congregation, repeating phrases like technological leap, architectural rebirth, and foundational transformation. He puffed out his chest as though vocabulary could rewrite reality. Beside him stood the young programmer, basking in applause he hadn't earned. Cameras flashed. Investors cheered. Analysts nodded approvingly. Not one person asked the most dangerous question in technology: what did you remove to make space for innovation? Systems tolerate additions. They punish removals. The young programmer took the microphone and told the world they had deleted redundant back-end infrastructure. He laughed as he described removing thousands of legacy conditions, conditions regulators once required, conditions auditors once verified, conditions that protected the company from legal ruin. He didn't know relics sometimes hold curses. Legacy code is not decoration. It is the accumulated memory of every mistake, crisis, negotiation, loophole, and legal entanglement a system has survived. Removing it is not modernization, it is amnesia. And amnesia has consequences. The first consequence appeared the following week, though the company didn't recognize it as such. A senior analyst requested historical financial reports from the system. The report generated eventually, but the numbers didn't match previous versions. They differed by fractions. Investors rarely panic over fractions, but auditors do. Fractions are footprints, and footprints reveal ghosts. The engineering team dismissed the issue as rounding errors. They didn't realize rounding errors are symptoms, not causes. The system wasn't rounding incorrectly. It was translating incomplete logic once supported by legacy components they'd mutilated in their quest for modernization. The second consequence surfaced days later. Cross-border transfers began requiring manual approvals. The automation script, built 5 years ago to comply with regulatory constraints, had been disconnected during refactoring. Nobody noticed until a customer complained. The young developer patched it temporarily, but didn't understand why the original logic existed. He believed his patch was superior. Patches create patches. Patches create cracks. Cracks invite collapse. Meanwhile, the marketing machine kept roaring. Documentaries, behind-the-scenes videos, and podcasts praised the company's technological renaissance. Influential tech voices called the young programmer a prodigy, a disruptor, a visionary. His followers grew by the thousands. His ego expanded faster than the codebase. No one asked him the only question that mattered. If your work is so revolutionary, why does the system still rely on components you didn't build? Because it did. They hadn't replaced my code. They had wallpapered over it. Beneath their shiny dashboards, beneath their PR statements, beneath their smiling interviews, my architecture stood like an old city whose alleys they painted but never mapped. A relic? Yes. A relic with logic that held the company together like bones beneath flesh. They celebrated ignorance the way gamblers celebrate luck, believing success was certainty, not chance. They drank champagne as though bubbles were blessings. They quoted projections as though fortune obeyed spreadsheets. They smiled for cameras as though cameras captured truth. But truth doesn't appear in videos. Truth appears in audits. Truth appears in edge cases. Truth appears when assumptions meet consequences. The celebration grew louder. The ignorance grew thicker. And the system, my system, grew tired of compensating for incompetence. What they called relics were guardians. What they called outdated was essential. What they removed in arrogance would return in vengeance. They believed history could be erased. They were wrong. History waits. Legacy sleeps. Curses don't chase. Curses watch. Their celebration was not a victory. It was an invitation. And soon, the guests they ignored would arrive. The applause would end. The reckoning would begin. The countdown to the company's IPO had reached a fever pitch. Executives paraded through boardrooms with the entitlement of lottery winners already spending their imagined fortune. They rehearsed speeches, polished press statements, and flooded social media with declarations of technological supremacy. Investors, quietly intoxicated by the promise of exponential returns, booked flights for the ringing of the opening bell. Meanwhile, deep inside the operations department, whispers circulated about an incoming audit. Nobody wanted to address it. Audits were always required before a company went public, but this particular one felt like an uninvited guest at a wedding, an entity that threatened to disrupt the illusion of perfection the leadership had constructed. Still, executives insisted everything was under control. They believed confidence was stronger than scrutiny. On a dull Monday morning, the illusion ended. Without warning, a team of financial regulators walked through the glass doors of the headquarters and proceeded directly to the upper floors, escorted by no one and intimidated by nothing. Their expressions were not hostile, merely devoid of theatrics. They possessed that unsettling calm reserved for people accustomed to finding lies disguised as innovation. The leadership team greeted them with smiles that cracked under the weight of forced enthusiasm. A polished presentation awaited them in the boardroom, slides filled with buzzwords like modular, scalable, and future-ready, narrated by the CTO who had spent months memorizing phrases that sounded visionary but explained nothing. The auditors listened politely and made no comments. They had not come for promises. They had come for proof. When the CTO finished his monologue, the lead auditor closed his folder and requested full access to the system. The request landed like a hammer. The celebratory atmosphere drained from the room. Suddenly, the executives realized that speeches, animated diagrams, and a charismatic young programmer were insufficient. Auditors needed architecture, lineage, validation rules, and an unbroken chain of logic. They needed to see how the company's numbers were produced, not how well the marketing team described them. They followed the engineering staff down the hallway to the secure development hub, where screens were quickly unlocked and terminals opened like surgical tables prepared for operation. The regulators sat down and began their exploration. The system looked sleek from the surface, dashboards gleaming with modern fonts and real-time activity monitors, but the auditors did not start at the surface. They went straight into the source code. Their questions began innocently enough. What did this module control? Why did this function connect to the risk models? Where were the version histories? With each inquiry, the engineering team hesitated. Confusion replaced enthusiasm. The young developer, once eager to showcase his achievements, tapped nervously on his keyboard, trying to navigate through areas he had boasted about improving. He opened one of the core validation scripts and froze. The logic was not written like typical modern code. It was layered with conditions referencing regulatory requirements, encrypted signatures, and audit triggers created over the course of multiple fiscal crises, elements he did not understand. One auditor leaned closer to the screen and scrolled deeper. Dependencies appeared like chains, every module linked to another, every process embedded with checks that extended beyond a simple call-and-response structure. This was not the architecture of a casual developer. It was the work of someone who had navigated chaos, absorbed institutional memory, and encoded survival strategies into logic. The auditors asked for documentation. The engineering team searched. They checked shared drives, repositories, and internal wikis. Nothing provided adequate explanations. What they found were fragments, outdated notes, abbreviated comments, and references to legal requirements that no one in the room could trace. The auditors asked for approval tokens. The engineers blinked. Tokens, they assumed, were outdated artifacts unnecessary in a modern system. Yet the auditors insisted. So the team searched again. What they discovered next tilted the balance of the room. The approval tokens were missing, not deleted, not relocated, simply expired. Every single token had been tied to an access identity that was no longer active. Those identities were mine. Without them, the system's compliance modules could not legally verify transactions, risk assessments, or reporting sequences. The auditors sat back and waited for explanations that no one could provide. The CTO attempted to reclaim control by claiming the architecture had been modernized. He stated that redundant legacy components had been removed and replaced with streamlined structures. The lead auditor asked him to define which components had been removed and why. His answer stumbled. His tone faltered. He did not understand the architecture he claimed to have rebuilt. As the engineers attempted to re-establish access, the system reacted. A series of integrity checks began triggering one after the other, silent warnings buried deep inside modules that were designed to activate whenever foundational code was altered without corresponding authorization. These triggers were not alarms meant to frighten. They were safeguards intended to prevent the system from operating illegally. Screens displayed messages requesting verification keys that no one possessed. Automated routines attempted to connect validation modules to regulatory logic that no longer had active signatures. The architecture was not malfunctioning. It was enforcing the rules embedded into it from years of compliance audits, acquisitions, tax modifications, and policy adaptations. It behaved the same way a locked vault behaves when a stranger punches in random codes. The realization spread slowly but unmistakably. The system did not belong to the leadership team. It belonged to the logic, the structure, and the dependencies built long before their marketing campaign. Removing a piece of legacy infrastructure had not modernized the company, it had amputated its nervous system. One auditor summarized the situation with unnerving clarity. The company had attempted to erect a skyscraper atop foundations they neither understood nor maintained. The new development team, eager to impress executives, had removed safeguards disguised as relics. They misunderstood the difference between outdated and irreplaceable. The executives stared at the evidence in silence, finally confronted with the truth they had spent months insulting. The lead auditor stood, closed his laptop, and announced that the IPO could not proceed. The company lacked verifiable compliance paths, documentation trails, and authorized approval tokens. The financial architecture was not legally certifiable. The presentation banners, the slogans, the promises, the interviews, the projected valuation, they disintegrated in a single sentence. Panic did not erupt. Instead, something worse occurred: dread. The executives remained seated like passengers on a ship, realizing too late that their captain had never learned to navigate. Their celebration had not been premature, it had been ignorant. As soon as the auditors left, internal blame began circulating. The young developer tried to explain his decisions, insisting that modernization required risk. The CTO defended him by claiming legacy systems were obstacles to progress. Neither realized the contradiction they embodied. They were boasting about an architecture they had never apprehended. The truth was harsher. They had treated the system like a machine that obeyed enthusiasm. They had believed code was a suggestion, not a contract. They assumed they could replace experience with confidence and eliminate complexity without respecting why it existed. The engineering staff tried to salvage the situation, but the problem was not technical anymore. It was epistemological. They did not know what they didn't know. They could not ask the right questions because they did not understand what the right questions were. The system was no longer a collection of scripts. It had become a locked vault guarding a history they had erased. They thought they were writing the future. In reality, they were vandalizing the past. By the end of the week, every executive understood something they should have understood the day they dismissed me. Legacy is not antique. Legacy is architecture. Legacy is continuity. Legacy is the memory of every disaster a system has survived. It cannot be replaced by ambition, and it refuses to be ignored. They had fired the only person who knew where the foundations were, then bragged about building higher floors. Their skyscraper had never stood tall. It had been floating on assumptions. The audit had not exposed a flaw, it had revealed the truth. The company did not own its system. The system owned the company. And without an architect, ownership is irrelevant. What remained now was not celebration but consequences. The executives sat in their silent offices, finally forced to confront what they had created. Their mistake was not firing me. Their mistake was believing the system was theirs to control. They had mistaken memory for clutter, history for inconvenience, and architecture for aesthetics. They had celebrated ignorance with conviction. Now, ignorance had sent the invoice. The first sign arrived so quietly that nobody took it seriously. A junior analyst noticed her dashboard numbers weren't updating. She refreshed the page, closed the application, rebooted her workstation, and shrugged when nothing changed. She assumed the servers were under maintenance. After all, systems glitch all the time in modern companies. Bugs are as normal as air conditioning failures or coffee machines running out of beans. But bugs don't stay quiet. Bugs don't spread. Bugs don't multiply. This one did. And like every disaster born from negligence, it started with something small enough to ignore. Within 40 minutes, 2 other departments reported anomalies. Automated payment schedules stalled mid-process. Confirmation receipts generated error messages instead of transaction codes. A support ticket flagged an unusual database lock. None of these incidents, taken alone, were catastrophic, so managers responded the way untrained leaders always do, with confidence instead of urgency. IT is working on it, one executive declared, without asking IT anything. It's probably a caching issue, another reassured, because confidence is cheaper than competence. The company continued operating, unaware that the system had already decided it was done pretending. By noon, dashboards across the organization froze entirely. Financial analysts stared at screens that displayed data as if time itself had stopped. Numbers that once fluctuated in real time remained static. Attempts to retrieve historical entries resulted in blank outputs or negative values that made no mathematical sense. Some employees assumed it was a visual bug. Others thought an update was rolling out. But the engineers, those who knew enough to panic, began sweating. They tried to access the servers, only to discover authentication loops blocking entry. Password resets failed. Administrative rights, previously granted without caution, now refused to acknowledge their existence. The system wasn't asking for credentials. It was asking for identity. And identity, in this case, belonged to someone who no longer worked there. Panic spreads in companies the same way smoke spreads in buildings, quietly at first, then suddenly visible everywhere. Engineers huddled around terminals that refused to obey. Executives demanded answers no one could provide. The young programmer, whose arrogance had once electrified boardrooms, sat paralyzed before screens he could no longer manipulate. He typed commands rapidly, each one rejected with a cold refusal. His modern frameworks, his refactored modules, his self-declared improvements had only disconnected the system from the intelligence that designed it. He had built a stage for innovation, but removed the actors who understood the script. Servers rebooted themselves in cycles. Databases flickered between active and suspended states. Logs showed timestamps referencing validation attempts with expired tokens. The architecture was not collapsing randomly. It was performing exactly as it had been built to perform under unauthorized modification. My system did not tolerate ignorance. It didn't negotiate with enthusiasm. It didn't respect titles, salaries, or LinkedIn recommendations. It respected logic, continuity, rules, history, and none of those remained inside the building. Someone finally asked the question they should have asked the day they fired me. Who can fix this? The room went silent. They knew the answer. And that answer tasted bitter. The CTO pretended otherwise. He called for a full engineering lockdown and instructed everyone to reroute through emergency servers. Those servers rejected access as well. They had been configured years ago, after a financial scare the public never learned about. During that crisis, the system was modified to prevent unauthorized rollback. Only 2 people held override rights, the compliance director, who had retired, and me. Desperation settled like humidity, thick, unavoidable, suffocating. The CTO sent messages across internal networks instructing all teams to pause transactions. He tried to contact vendors, regulators, and investors, hoping someone outside the building could calm the storm. None could. The company's infrastructure was not a collection of isolated programs. It was a single breathing entity, and they had severed its connection to the one person who understood its physiology. Then came the moment nobody could ignore. Large screens mounted in the executive hub, screens used for investor forecasts, performance metrics, and market readiness, went black. Not blink. Black. As though the system had not crashed, but rather closed its eyes. Someone tried to reboot them manually. Another attempted to bypass access permissions. Nothing changed. Every monitor in every office, hallway, and conference room displayed the same void. Employees stared at dark rectangles where numbers once lived, where optimism had been measured daily. Executives who had built their identities on data now stared at silence. The company, once a machine of momentum, stood frozen. What they feared wasn't the blackout. It was what the blackout represented, dependency. They weren't in control. They had never been in control. Technology had allowed them to masquerade as leaders, but leadership requires comprehension. They hadn't replaced me, they had removed the translator between ambition and reality. It was only after the 20th failed restart attempt that someone uttered my name. They didn't speak it loudly. They didn't dare. It wasn't reverence. It was acknowledgement. The CTO ordered his assistant to call me. The phone rang twice. I saw the caller ID. I declined. They called again and again and again, each attempt revealing more panic. They sent emails with subject lines evolving from polite requests to urgent pleas. I ignored them. They drove a company car to my house and sent a lawyer to negotiate. I invited him in, offered him a cup of coffee, and listened while he explained that the company is experiencing a temporary system disruption. Temporary. That word amused me. Temporary problems don't trigger regulatory audits, halt financial transactions, or erase dashboards company-wide. Temporary problems don't reveal architectural ignorance. Temporary problems don't expose executives who built careers on buzzwords instead of knowledge. The lawyer asked whether I could assist. I asked whether he understood the nature of the system. He didn't. So I sent him back with nothing except caffeine and a polite refusal. By the second day, the company entered crisis mode. Payment systems halted. Vendor invoices failed to clear. Client charges stalled mid-transfer. Investors reached out demanding explanations. The markets, sensing instability, began whispering uncertainty. Emails from brokerage firms questioned valuation integrity. Regulators requested emergency compliance statements. The CTO attempted to reassure everyone, but confidence without architecture is noise. Noise doesn't calm panic. It amplifies it. The young programmer tried one last desperate maneuver. He attempted to rebuild the core module from scratch. His fingers moved quickly on the keyboard, as if speed could substitute for competence. But the system was not a set of scripts waiting for commands. It was a narrative encoded in rules. When he pushed the new code, the system rejected it outright. Access denied. Validation failed. The logs recorded the attempt in unforgiving detail. His new architecture was not compatible with the logic embedded in the old. He had modernized the walls, but ignored the foundation. He assumed code-obeys developers. He forgot developers must obey structure. More departments reported failures. The investor relations team could not produce quarterly summaries. The compliance department couldn't verify tax allocations. The audit division filed an internal alert stating they could no longer certify data lineage. The blackout was not a malfunction, it was a verdict. Systems behave like organisms. They protect themselves when attacked. And here, the architecture wasn't fighting intrusion. It was rejecting incompetence. The company hadn't been hacked. It hadn't been targeted. It hadn't been sabotaged. It was waking up. The system was built to respond to one scenario above all others, the removal of institutional memory. They mistook legacy for fragility. They mistook documentation for clutter. They mistook architecture for ornament. And architecture, when abandoned, rebels. The CTO scheduled an emergency board meeting. Security guards were stationed outside conference rooms. Half the executives arrived without sleep. Others arrived in denial. The CEO paced like a trapped animal. The silence in that room was heavier than collapse. Every person present felt the same truth pulling at their ribs. They had fired the wrong person. 3 months earlier, they celebrated my departure as progress. Today, they realized it had been the ignition point of their downfall. Systems do not forgive arrogance. They record it. They wait. And when ignorance violates architecture, architecture responds, not loudly, not emotionally, but decisively. The day the screens went black wasn't the day the system failed. It was the day the company was finally forced to see itself. Silence is rarely neutral in the world of finance. To ordinary employees, silence may mean calm, but to investors, it signals something much darker, withheld information. And when information is withheld, capital behaves like a predator. It circles. It watches. It senses weakness. In the days following the company-wide blackout, the silence around the pending IPO became deafening. Emails that once detailed growth projections turned vague. Conference calls that previously overflowed with boasts and bravado became curt and evasive. Analysts who once praised the company's innovative structure now detected an unusual pattern. No one at the executive level could provide concrete numbers. They didn't know it yet, but blood had entered the water. The IPO, once hailed as a guaranteed success, stalled without explanation. No official statements were released. No forward guidance was offered. Dates that had been displayed proudly on investor packets were removed. Invitations to press events were postponed without rescheduling. The stock exchanges, always hungry for clarity, requested updates. None arrived. Instead, rumors leaked quietly, spreading through financial forums, private investor groups, and brokerage circles. Something was wrong, something beyond a technical hiccup, beyond a temporary disruption. Something structural. The first public crack appeared during a televised interview with a finance reporter who asked a senior board member why the IPO documents still hadn't been filed. His response was a word salad of excuses, phrases like unexpected procedural delay and ongoing optimization cycle. But in finance, language matters. No investor trusts optimization when they were promised readiness. The interview circulated online within hours. The comments beneath it were merciless. Traders smelled panic. Analysts smelled deception. Competitors smelled opportunity. The company tried to regain control by releasing a short statement claiming that a minor technical instability had temporarily affected internal operations. That phrase, minor technical instability, became a meme in investor circles. It was too vague to be reassuring and too specific to ignore. Minor problems don't halt IPOs. Minor problems don't freeze financial dashboards. Minor problems don't erase investor confidence. The markets reacted accordingly. Private valuation forecasts dropped by nearly 10% overnight. Then regulators made their presence public. They demanded clarification about compliance modules reportedly offline. They requested explanations for missing audit tokens. They asked for details about the system responsible for calculating investor risk models. These were not optional queries. They were the financial equivalent of subpoenas. Regulators don't waste time on rumors. They strike only when they smell vulnerability. And now, they smelled it everywhere. The board convened an emergency session. They debated communication strategies, considered changing the IPO timeline, even discussed firing the CTO in a desperate attempt to redirect blame. But firing one man wouldn't solve the problem. The real issue wasn't personnel, it was architecture. Without control of the system, they couldn't verify anything, not projections, not historical numbers, not compliance trails. In an IPO, unverifiable data is a death sentence. Investors began calling individual board members directly, bypassing formal channels. These weren't small-time speculators. They were institutions, banks, funds, conglomerates that managed billions. They wanted answers, and they asked the kinds of questions that expose truth. What happened to the core system? Why did legacy protections trigger? Who controlled the architecture? Why is the architect no longer employed? The board tried to minimize the issue, but financial professionals don't respond to euphemisms. They respond to evidence. When evidence is missing, suspicion becomes certainty. And suspicion spreads faster than any virus. Meanwhile, competitors watched the spectacle with smug patience. They had envied the company's projected valuation, but envy dissolves when arrogance collapses. Competitors leaked subtle comments to the press, statements like, "Rapid modernization carries risks and legacy systems often contain critical logic." No one mentioned names, but everyone understood the target. Competitors didn't need to attack. The company was doing their work for them. At the same time, the tech journalism ecosystem erupted. Reporters smelled a scandal. They dug into patent filings, job board posts, employee turnover patterns, and leaked internal memos. Articles emerged suggesting that the company's entire modernization narrative might have been fabricated. One publication quoted an anonymous engineer describing the infrastructure as held together by a single master key that nobody else understands. The phrase went viral, a billion-dollar product held together by one man. Investors reacted like sharks tasting blood. They wanted to know why that man was fired. Pressure mounted. The board attempted damage control. They sent representatives to reassure large investors that everything was under control, that the modernization was intentional, that minor delays were expected. But investors don't invest in control, they invest in certainty. And certainty had evaporated. In private message groups, investors began abandoning the IPO altogether. Some redirected funds to competitor companies with stable historical architectures. Others postponed commitments until the situation clarified. A few acted aggressively, contacting regulators with their own concerns. When money asks questions, governments listen. And money was now roaring. Inside headquarters, morale dissolved. Employees whispered about approaching layoffs. The marketing team stopped posting triumphal updates. The young programmer, once treated like a genius, walked the halls avoiding eye contact. The CTO disappeared into closed-door meetings where his voice grew more desperate. The CEO, whose ego had ballooned during the IPO buildup, lost his composure. He blamed engineering. He blamed regulators. He blamed timing. He blamed everything except the truth, that he had built a future without understanding the past. Investors, however, understood cause and effect. They knew that companies don't fall apart because of isolated failures. They fall apart because leadership confuses motion with progress. The modern codebase, so proudly advertised, now looked like a reckless demolition instead of renovation. Sophisticated investors asked whether the so-called modernization had removed critical logic. They wondered whether legacy code carried institutional memory. They questioned whether the system had been sabotaged, not maliciously, but through incompetence. Then came the moment that cemented doubt into fear. A leaked internal communication surfaced from a senior engineer. In it, he admitted that several compliance modules were disabled because we couldn't figure out how they were originally validated. The admission went viral. Investors don't fear mistakes, they fear ignorance. And now ignorance was undeniable. The company attempted counteroffensives. They scheduled emergency investor briefings, offered compensation incentives, and promised accelerated fixes. None mattered. Investors didn't want promises. They wanted architecture. They wanted proof that the system could scale legally, safely, reliably. They wanted foundation, not paint. The markets drew conclusions the board refused to utter aloud. The company was never ready for an IPO. It had sprinted toward valuation without verifying stability. It had dismissed experience as obstruction. It had replaced the architect with enthusiasm and expected the building to stand. As investor withdrawals accumulated, private valuations plummeted further. Analysts who once praised the company now downgraded predictions. Television pundits discussed the unfolding story in somber tones, comparing it to other spectacular collapses driven by hubris. The company was no longer the future, it was a cautionary tale. Regulators issued another formal demand: produce documentation proving system lineage before the IPO can proceed. The board had no such documentation. They stalled. Regulators issued a deadline. The board extended their silence. Silence did not reassure anyone. Silence confirmed suspicion. Investors finally understood the truth. The company wasn't suffering from a temporary outage. It wasn't facing a rough patch. It wasn't innovating too quickly. It was built on a foundation that only one person understood, and that person had been shown the door without a handshake, without a thank you, without recognition of the cost of losing him. Investors smelled blood because the board had wounded itself. Companies don't bleed from external attacks. They bleed from internal arrogance. And blood, once spilled, invites predators. The knock on the door arrived on a Wednesday morning, just as I was finishing a remote consultation for a logistics firm struggling with database fragmentation. My days had become quieter since leaving my former employer, not because I lacked opportunities, but because I had finally found environments where competence mattered more than posturing. The firms I worked with didn't care about fashion statements disguised as innovation. They cared about results. They asked questions instead of making assumptions. They valued architecture, not slogans. That morning, as I reviewed code structures written thoughtfully rather than theatrically, I heard 3 hesitant knocks, each one softer than the last, as though the knocker feared the door itself might judge him. When I opened it, I found the CTO, no entourage, no confidence, no arrogance, just a trembling man whose posture had collapsed under the weight of consequences he once dismissed as trivial. He looked older than when I last saw him, his shoulders slumped, his tie uneven, his expression drained of the certainty he once weaponized. Behind him, 2 board members stood waiting, their expensive suits unable to mask panic. They were not here to exchange pleasantries. They were here because something inside the company had broken beyond their capacity to repair. And for the first time in years, they were forced to acknowledge it. Before anyone spoke, silence filled the doorway, a silence they seemed afraid to disturb. I didn't offer them a seat. Not out of malice, but because the burdens they carried didn't require comfort. They required truth, and truth rarely comes with cushions. Eventually, the CTO cleared his throat, though his voice cracked before a single word left his mouth. He had rehearsed a speech, that much I could tell, but speeches crumble when faced with the person they once underestimated. "We need your help," he finally whispered, as if confessing a crime. There it was. Not a greeting. Not an apology. Not even an explanation. A plea. I watched him struggle to maintain composure while the board members shifted uneasily. These were the same men who once applauded my dismissal, who drank champagne while celebrating the liberation from legacy dependence. Now, their eyes started nervously, Betraying the truth, their celebration had become a funeral procession, and nobody wanted to admit who built the coffin. I didn't respond immediately. I let silence settle again, not out of cruelty, but because silence reveals character faster than confrontation. The CTO broke first. "The system is resisting us," he admitted. "Nothing behaves the way it should. We can't authenticate financial reports. We can't restore compliance modules. We can't trace investor data. The architecture is alive." I finished. He swallowed. Yes, but the architecture hadn't come alive. It had simply stopped tolerating ignorance. They hadn't inherited a system. They had inherited responsibility, and responsibility ignores ego. The CTO gestured toward his colleagues, who stepped forward with folders filled with contracts, proposals, and desperate amendments. They thought paperwork could solve what arrogance had created. They assumed signatures could mend fractures they didn't understand. They believed ownership was something that could be granted by decree rather than earned by comprehension. "We want you to return," one board member said, attempting authority but failing miserably. "We're prepared to offer a competitive compensation POC." I raised my hand, and he froze. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an autopsy. "You don't want me back," I said calmly. "You want your system back." The CTO opened his mouth, then shut it. Honesty, for once, won the battle. "Yes," he admitted. "We want the system to obey again." Obey. That word hung in the air like smoke. The system had never obeyed them. It had only tolerated them. Architecture isn't obedient. It follows rules. It respects logic. It protects integrity. They mistook obedience for functionality. They mistook silence for consent. They mistook stability for loyalty. They thought technology served ambition. They forgot technology serves design. "What do you want?" the board member asked, attempting to recover the illusion of control. Control. That was the irony. Control had never been part of their vocabulary, only dominance. But there's a difference between controlling something and owning outcomes. They wanted neither understanding nor responsibility. They wanted a miracle in the shape of the man they discarded. I stepped aside and allowed them into my office, not because I owed them consideration, but because this conversation required clarity. I sat opposite them while they remained standing, unsure where authority lived now. For years, they had governed with power measured in titles. Today, power belonged to the only person who understood the system they'd weaponized against themselves. "I don't negotiate salary," I said. "I negotiate ownership." Their expressions shifted instantly. Salaries are tokens. Ownership is transformation. Salaries reward contribution. Ownership defines direction. One board member attempted to laugh, but even he couldn't summon enough denial to sustain the sound. "You want equity?" he asked. "No," I replied. "I want control. Control of architecture. Control of direction. Control of what they once called relics, but now recognized as foundations." They had treated the code like scaffolding. They didn't understand it was the building. "That's impossible," the CTO said, though his tone held no conviction. "So, is your IPO?" I responded. The silence afterward was not argumentative. It was acceptance wrapped in regret. I knew the calculation happening behind their eyes. They were weighing humiliation against survival. And survival always chooses humility eventually. What they feared wasn't giving me control. It was admitting I had earned it long before they noticed. "What does control mean to you?" the board member asked, almost whispering. "It means autonomy," I answered. "Authority over infrastructure. Authority over decisions affecting the system. Authority over stability. No marketing interference. No executive revisions. No shortcuts disguised as innovation." They exchanged glances, each one realizing the implications. In their world, authority flowed downward. In mine, authority flowed from architecture. They had forgotten the golden rule of systems. You don't own what you can't understand. "And if we agree?" the CTO asked. "Then your system lives," I replied. "If you don't, it collapses. Not because I want it to, but because it no longer recognizes your input." They didn't argue. They couldn't. By now, the system had already chosen its allies. Software built without understanding becomes hostile to the ignorant. They had created their own adversary, not me, but the architecture they mutilated without respect. One board member finally exhaled. We accept. Acceptance wasn't relief. It was surrender. True surrender doesn't come from defeat. It comes from realization. They realized architecture isn't replaceable. They realized the man they fired wasn't redundant. He was essential. They realized skill wasn't a relic. It was the spine. Before they left, the CTO did something I never expected. He apologized. Not theatrically. Not strategically. Quietly. Earnestly. His voice cracked under the strain of regret. I thought modernization meant removal, he said. I didn't understand that modernization without comprehension is destruction. I didn't absolve him. Apologies don't rewrite ignorance. Apologies acknowledge it. That's why systems rebel, I replied. Not because they're fragile, but because they're faithful to their creators. They left my office with contracts, not victories. They came seeking repair. They left understanding consequence. They had expected the man they fired to be bitter. Instead, they found someone who had evolved. They expected negotiation. Instead, they found requirements. They expected obedience. Instead, they found terms. They didn't return for talent. They returned for truth. And truth doesn't wear suits. Truth wears architecture. The morning of the IPO was supposed to be a coronation. For months, executives had envisioned themselves standing beneath confetti cannons, smiling for cameras as the market validated their self-proclaimed genius. They arrived early at the office, dressed in tailored suits that shimmered under studio lights. Makeup artists polished their faces for television interviews. A film crew from a major financial network positioned cameras to capture the transformation of a once private company into a publicly traded titan. The CEO rehearsed his celebratory speech, imagining the applause that would accompany each inflated number he uttered. The CTO stood nearby, attempting to appear confident despite the haunted look in his eyes. He now understood the truth, but he was too deep in the narrative to escape it. Wall Street's opening bell was scheduled for 9:30 a.m. The company's representatives gathered in a sleek conference room that overlooked the city skyline, where skyscrapers glistened like monuments to ambition. Their screens displayed a countdown timer linked to the exchange: 10 minutes, then 8, then 5. The CEO bragged about strategic partnerships and projected dominance. He spoke as though the market had already crowned him a visionary. No one questioned his tone. They dared not disrupt the illusion. After all, perception had become their only asset. What they didn't know is that perception collapses faster than architecture. At 9:29 a.m., the exchange computers prepared to list the company's ticker symbol. Traders waited. Algorithms positioned orders. Institutional investors hovered, hands poised above keyboards. Then, just as the bell rang, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of launching, the system rejected the listing. The ticker symbol didn't appear. It didn't trade. It didn't fluctuate. It didn't exist. One moment, the company was poised to join the stock market. The next moment, it had disappeared from it. Shock rippled through the room. At first, executives assumed there must be a delay, perhaps a technical glitch at the exchange. Then phones began ringing. Messages flooded devices. Emails arrived with subject lines that contained no pleasantries, only demands. Regulators needed immediate clarification. Brokers wanted explanations. News outlets reported an anomaly. Observers speculated on social media. Confusion metastasized into panic. The CEO, flushed red with indignation, barked orders at assistants who could not interpret the silence that followed each failed request. In less than 10 minutes, panic turned into disaster. The exchange issued a temporary halt notice, citing compliance irregularities. Journalists swarmed the story, eager to broadcast what should have been a triumph, but was quickly becoming a corporate autopsy. The headlines evolved in real time, each more damning than the last. IPO delayed indefinitely, internal systems unverified, core infrastructure untraceable, compliance documentation missing. Analysts who once praised the company's leadership now questioned its competence. The valuation evaporated like mist beneath a rising sun. The company attempted damage control. The CEO stepped in front of microphones, but his voice shook. He attempted to blame unexpected regulatory queries and short-term verification issues. His excuses fell flat. Markets don't respond to tone, they respond to truth. Traders, sensing imminent collapse, pulled their funds. Institutional investors withdrew commitments. Hedge funds shorted anything associated with the company. The scent of arrogance had transformed into the scent of blood. Then came the headline that detonated everything. The man they fired holds the code that holds the company. The article spread across financial networks, tech forums, and social media platforms within minutes. It traced the company's architectural lineage, identified me as the original designer, and explained how modernization efforts dismantled logic they never understood. It detailed the expired approval tokens, the missing documentation, the compliance modules no engineer could access without violating federal regulations. It painted a portrait not of sabotage, but of negligence, negligence wrapped in ego masquerading as innovation. And investors, who live by information, saw the company for what it was, a house of cards built atop a foundation they had thrown out with the man who created it. By midday, the board tried to reach me again. They left voicemails, emails, and handwritten notes. But the time for conversation had long passed. I had no interest in returning to salvage reputations built on disrespect. My silence wasn't revenge. It was a mirror. They saw themselves in it, and they hated the reflection. Journalists camped outside corporate headquarters. Employees were instructed not to speak. Regulators issued demands the company could not meet. Financial watchdogs launched investigations. Competitors, once intimidated by the company's projected valuation, now issued discreet hiring offers to employees fleeing the wreckage. Like scavengers waiting for carcasses, they knew timing was everything. And this carcass still had meat on it. The board held an emergency meeting that stretched into the early hours of the morning. They debated what options remained. None were viable. Without the architecture functioning, they couldn't produce verified financial statements. Without those statements, they couldn't satisfy regulators. Without certification, they couldn't go public. Without going public, their valuation collapsed. Without valuation, their investors abandoned them. Every decision, every shortcut, every dismissal of expertise circled back to one truth they had refused to acknowledge. The future they tried to build was anchored in a past they had declared obsolete. Employees felt it too. Some cried. Some resigned. Some sent out resumes faster than servers had once processed transactions. The system wasn't the only thing that had blacked out, so had loyalty. Corporate loyalty is not emotional. It is transactional. And the moment the transaction failed, the loyalty expired. Meanwhile, media outlets and industry analysts dissected the company's mistakes. They pointed out the recklessness of removing legacy infrastructure without understanding its purpose. They interviewed former engineers who revealed warnings ignored by leadership. They explained how modern code is not inherently better, it is only useful when built upon knowledge, not arrogance. The narrative shifted permanently. The company wasn't an innovator. It was a cautionary tale. The board eventually made a final attempt to control the damage. They proposed reinstating me with full authority as a symbolic gesture. What they misunderstood was simple. Architecture doesn't care about symbolism. It cares about logic. And logic had already delivered its verdict. Even if I returned, rebuilding trust would take years, and trust is not a commodity traded on exchanges. It is earned. They had squandered it. The CEO resigned under pressure, his dream of fame reduced to footnotes in articles about hubris. The CTO, crushed by the weight of consequences, submitted his resignation shortly after. Executive chairs that once held men who believed themselves superior now held emptiness, monuments to illusion. The company, once worth billions in theoretical valuation, now struggled to justify its existence. I didn't celebrate. Celebration belongs to the triumphant. I hadn't triumphed. I had simply refused to participate in their delusion. The market punished arrogance for me. I did not sabotage them. I did not manipulate the system. I didn't threaten or intervene. I stepped away. And stepping away was enough. Legacy does not destroy. It reveals. Legacy does not fight. It remembers. Legacy does not die. It waits for the moment when ignorance exposes itself. They fired me to modernize the system. They forgot who built the system. They forgot that the system was not lines of code, it was experience, memory, adaptation, scars, decisions, risks, evolutions, victories, and defeats encoded into logic. They thought replacing the architect was progress. They could not comprehend that the architect was the blueprint. The IPO didn't fail because the market rejected innovation. The IPO never happened because reality rejected arrogance. And reality always wins.